Okay, so in modern language, whether it's English or Hebrew or Russian, actually I'm not as familiar with the Russian, but we tend to overuse exaggeration. You know what exaggeration is? And a hyperbole, to say something more than what it really is. Is there a lot of exaggeration in Russian? Okay, it's like we use it so much nowadays that it's almost like we don't understand the real meaning of certain words. We don't use them in the correct way. We use them to exaggerate. We say things like, I saw a great movie. Are you trying to figure out the word exaggeration? We saw a great movie last night. I saw a great movie last night. It was awesome. We use the word awesome to describe a movie that we watch. If we realize the real meaning of awesome, we say, really? The movie was awesome. It inspired awe in you. It inspired this mixed feeling of fear and respect. It's the meaning of awesome. But we say it for things like going to see a movie. Or we say something like, I just got back from my trip to India. It was unbelievable. Unbelievable. Really, is that the trip was so unique and outrageous that it's impossible to really believe that everything you said happened. These words tend to lose their meaning because we use them so loosely. We don't use them according to their true meanings. We all do it. I do it as well. And I understand there's a purpose for exaggeration. There's a place for exaggeration. We use exaggeration to get a point across. But I think in our day and age, especially, social media has really caused a lot of exaggeration. Why? Especially if you have a YouTube channel or if you're on other social media, you're always trying to get viewers. Get people to watch your video. Constantly trying to get people to watch us. And so you're at the same time competing with millions of others. And so people exaggerate things to get them to watch you instead of someone else. But I think it's happened to the point where we really are forgetting the true meaning of some of these words. Especially this word epic. Everybody says that these things are epic, which has nothing to do with describing a situation. It talks about a certain genre of writing. And yet we say it to describe all sorts of things. So in today's text, we have one of those words. Chapter 2 of Acts. We have another word that's really kind of lost its meaning in today's world. And it's the word amazing. Amazing. Madhim. We say things like, that pizza I ate was amazing. Is that really the way you want to describe food that you're eating? Is that the real meaning of amazing? If we really understood the meaning of the word amazing, I don't think we would use it so often to describe trivial things like this. And in just a minute, we're going to talk about the true meaning of the word amazing. But in Acts 2, we see something that truly was amazing, according to the true meaning of the word. The events at Pentecost, at this establishment of the church, amazed the people. We see this word twice in our text today. The people were amazed. We're going to see it in verses 7 and 12. So let's read. Our text today is in Acts 2 from verses 5 to 13. So let's start by reading our text, 5 to 13 in Acts chapter 2. And there were dwelling at Jerusalem Jews, devout men, out of every nation under heaven. Now when this was noised abroad, the multitude came together and were confounded, because that every man heard them speak in his own language. Remember, we saw that last week. The Holy Spirit came, and they were all able to speak the languages of everyone there. Verse 7. And they were all amazed, there's our word, amazed, and marveled, saying one to another, Behold, are not all these which speak Galileans? And how hear we every man in our own tongue wherein we were born? Parthians and Medes and Elamites, and the dwellers in Mesopotamia and in Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia and Egypt, and in the parts of Libya about Cyrene, and strangers of Rome, Jews and proselytes. Cretes and Arabians, we do hear them speak in our tongues the wonderful works of God. And they were all amazed, verse 12, and were in doubt or perplexed, saying one to another, What meaneth this? Others mocking said, These men are full of new wine. So we see this word amazed. What is the word amazed? What does it mean to be amazed? Truly to be amazed. It means to be astonished, or maybe even a bit confused, perplexed. And you're astonished or you're confused because of something that has caused a bit of fear or surprise or wonder. If we look at the Greek word here for this word, it's the same Greek word in both verses. It means literally to stand out of yourself. So what does it mean? It's something that maybe stands outside of your full ability to understand it. To be amazed means you almost fail to understand completely what you have seen or experienced. Something that truly amazes you is something you most likely don't fully understand. And so what those people saw in Acts 2 truly amazed them. And it wasn't because they watched a great movie or went on vacation or ate a delicious pizza. They were amazed in the true sense of the word amazed. Because they witnessed a work of God. And they didn't fully understand it, but it caused them to greatly fear and reverence the one who was doing it. And we can see their specific source of amazement in verse 11. Verse 11, it says, these men are saying, we do hear them speak in our tongues the wonderful or mighty works of God. They were amazed because the disciples were speaking all these languages. Languages that they didn't know. They never learned these languages. And the subject of what they were talking about was the wonderful works of God. In short, we could say that people were amazed by the work of God. They both saw a work of God, that speaking in tongues was a work of God, and what they were speaking about were the works of God as well. Why was this so amazing? First, if we look at the list of nations in verses 9 to 11, we see about 15 different languages represented. So many Jews were there in Jerusalem from all over the world. Some of them had moved there to live in Jerusalem, and many more were there just visiting temporarily. They were there because it was Chag Shavuot. It was Pentecost, Feast of Weeks. And so all Jews were required to come to Jerusalem for that feast. So there were many Jews there visiting as well. And everyone there probably spoke a common language, probably understood Greek or Aramaic. But each one had a mother tongue. We all here have some sort of a common language, but we have a mother tongue of the countries we come from. These people that were gathered in Jerusalem all had a mother tongue, their first language. So what amazed these men, these Jews who came from all over the world, was that these disciples, who were not from other countries, they were there from Galilee and the area in Israel. However, they could speak all of their languages, all these languages of the people that came. This amazed them. And to add to their amazement, was the fact that these men that were these disciples weren't just from Israel, but they were from a specific region of Israel. They were from Galilee. They were Galileans. Why is it even more amazing that Galileans were speaking all these languages? Notice what they say, their astonishment in verses 7 and 8. They were all amazed and marveled, saying one to another, "Behold, are not all these which speak Galileans? And how hear we every man in our own tongue wherein we were born?" Galileans were thought to be unlearned and ignorant men, to use the words of the Sanhedrin in chapter 4. Remember when Peter and John were giving a great defense to them, they said, these are just Galileans. These aren't smart guys. How are they able to do this? Same thing with the tongues. These are Galileans. How are they able to speak all these languages? We don't view them as smart people. And especially what's interesting is Galileans also were known for not even being able to speak their own language. They swallowed their syllables. They had a hard time with the guttural sounds of Hebrew. They couldn't even handle their own mother language, and here they are speaking 15 other languages. It was clearly, what was going on here was clearly a wonderful, a mighty work of God. And as a result, these men were truly amazed by the real meaning of the word amazed. They were astonished. They didn't fully understand what was going on. And it even caused in them a bit of reverential fear. Yirat Adonai. In verses 12 and 13 then, so they're all amazed. But we see two different responses to what happens in verses 12 and 13. There's two groups of people. There's a group of people in verse 12 and a group of people in verse 13. Verse 12 says, "They were all amazed and were in doubt," or perplexed, saying one to another, "What meaneth this?" What does this mean? They stood there amazed and perplexed. They knew what they were seeing was a wonderful work of God. But they didn't understand completely what they were seeing. What was going on? What was God doing? And so they said to each other, "What does this mean? What is the meaning of this?" Not only that, but what that question means is they want to know more. We may not understand it, but it's causing them to want to know what it does mean. They wanted to know more about this wonderful work of God. Verse 5 really describes these men in verse 12. Verse 5 talks about men who were gathered there in Jerusalem, devout men. They're described as devout men. The word really means God-fearing men. These were God-fearing men that when they saw the work of God, they were amazed and they wanted to know more. What's going on? We want to know what this work of God means. And then you have another group of people in verse 13. Others, tells us there's another group of people. Others, mocking, said, "These men are full of new wine." These were not God-fearing people. They mocked the disciples. We talked about what it is to mock back in Luke 22. But basically, they were refusing to believe that this was indeed from God. And instead, they mocked and they made fun. Maybe the sentence here is accusing them of being drunk. You're speaking nonsense. And so, we see the reason why there were two different responses, two groups of people. They both saw the same wonderful work of God, but they had two different responses. The devout men, the God-fearing men, they understood they saw a work of God, and they were amazed by it. And even though they didn't completely understand it, they wanted to know what it means. So they asked the question, what does this mean? To put it another way, people who are God-fearing will not only be amazed when they see a wonderful work of God, but their amazement will lead them on, maybe you would call it a journey to know God better. It drives them to know God better. It will cause them to seek God further. And they won't rest until they discover the answer to their question, what does this mean? And as they discover what it means, it draws them into a closer relationship with God, with the one who is doing that wonderful work. But again, the other group in verse 13, they don't care. They don't care what God is doing or what he's done. They fail to realize all the wonderful works of God. They have no interest to discover what it means. And as a result, they never draw close to God. Often they just get further away from God. So if we want to draw closer to God, those that draw closer to God are the ones who understand that there's a work of God going on, and they're driven to understand what it is. Now, obviously, our situation today is a bit different than Acts chapter 2, because the men of Acts chapter 2 didn't have what we have today. What do we have today that they didn't have? Well, they had some of the Bible, they had the Tanakh, but they did not have the Brit HaChadashah. They didn't have the New Testament yet. Today we have the New Testament. And so we have an advantage. We may not be able to see all these miracles that were happening there in the early church, but we can read, like we are today, we can read about all the wonderful works of God. We can read about all the wonderful works from the Tanakh and all the wonderful works from the New Testament era. We can look back on what God has done and still be amazed. And it's that amazement that should drive us closer to God. As we read about these things and we try to figure out what it means, and as we discover what it means, it should draw us closer to God. What are we amazed by from the Bible? There's a lot we could be amazed about. There's so much we could say. So many wonderful works of God we could look at. But I just want to look at one thing today, since we're focusing on the book of Acts. We don't know exactly what the exact wonderful works they were preaching about there. I would imagine it focused on Yeshua, on his work of redemption on the cross. This was something, obviously the greatest work, the mighty work of God. But one thing I want to look at today is the establishment of the church. That's what we've been focusing on here so far in Acts 2. The establishment of the church was a wonderful work of God. And it should amaze us as we look today on how exactly God did it. The one thing that's really amazing, at least for me, I hope for you as well, even looking back on it, is how God brought everything together that needed to happen at the right time in order to establish and grow the early church. Even though it happened 2,000 years ago, and we can't look at it firsthand like those men were in Jerusalem, we can still read about it and be amazed by how God did it. And it's amazing because it reminds us of the sovereignty of God. It reminds us that God is in control of even the world events to bring about his purposes. And the sovereignty of God should always cause us a bit of amazement. Remember, to be amazed is to be astonished with a sense of wonder or fear, reverential fear. And God's sovereignty certainly should do that. So let's talk about how God established and grew the church. Because God chose a specific point in time to establish the church. And it was perfect timing. 2,000 years ago, the situation in the world was just right for the church to begin. And it's a clear display of God's sovereignty. We can still be amazed by just how God worked everything out in order to begin his church. Not only to begin it, but to have it grow and spread so quickly. It's quite amazing when we look at the history of the church. God had all the right conditions in place at that time. The beginning of the church in around, I guess we say 33 AD, was the perfect timing. 33. Yeah. It was the perfect timing because it was God's timing. The conditions of the world were right. Some people may say, it seems like today would be a good time to start the church. We're so interconnected. How quickly could we spread a message now? All this technology, we're so interconnected. So much access to information. But I don't know that it would grow faster today than it did 2,000 years ago. There's a lot higher level of skepticism today because of all the information going around. I believe God's perfect timing was 2,000 years ago. And let's start by talking about the language situation 2,000 years ago. Actually, before we go back 2,000 years, we need to go back 4,000 years. We got to go all the way back to Tower of Babel. Open up to Genesis 11. Genesis 11. Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel. What happened at the Tower of Babel? A group of people decided to unite in one spot, right? And they all spoke the same language in verse 1 of Genesis 11. The whole earth was of one language and of one speech. They had unity. How easy it to be united. What if we all spoke the same language? That would be great. To be united. They had one language which created a unity. The problem was their unity was based on the wrong thing. They were using their unity to make themselves strong and to bring glory to themselves. What did they say in verse 4? Why did they build the tower? Verse 4, it says they wanted to do it to let us make us a name. Let's make a name for ourselves. That's why they were doing it. To spread their glory instead of God's glory. So obviously God didn't like that. So what did he do? Many languages. He confounded the languages, which is how he scattered them throughout the entire world. They were united, one language, but doing the wrong thing, so God spread them out. So God broke their unity by confounding their language. So they couldn't understand each other. And hence we have the name Babel. Now let's go back to Acts 2. Men were gathered who spoke many of those languages, many languages. And God wanted to bring an important message to all of them. It's a message that indeed would unify them with the right message. So what did God do? Through the Holy Spirit, as we saw, the disciples were able to speak God's message to everyone there in their language. Everyone could understand the same message, even though many languages. They could be unified by one message. So basically what God's doing in Acts 2 is kind of a reverse of what happened at the Tower of Babel. When God established the church, he wanted unity within it. But he wanted them to be unified with the right message, the message of the gospel. At Babel, they were unified, but their message was a wrong message. It was a selfish message. It was a message of, let us make us a name. Let's make ourselves great. Let's focus on us. Let's unite around us. Let's focus all our power and abilities on us. That was the message of Babel. But at Pentecost, in Acts 2, the message was different. Many languages there, but the message was the same for everyone. It was to be a message that would unite everyone, not for the glory of themselves, but for the glory of God. They were to be united with a focus on God and not on man. And so the first thing that should amaze us about the creation of the church is that all these different languages from different countries, different backgrounds, God united them through the preaching of one message in a way that they all could hear and understand. God gave these simple Galileans the ability to speak. In Babel, God created a language barrier to prevent man's glory from spreading his message. But at Pentecost, God broke down the language barrier in order to promote his message, to promote his glory. This is all part of God's sovereignty, and it should amaze us. And the second thing that should amaze us about the establishment of the church is how he was able to spread it and grow it so quickly. Went throughout the entire world, and so I'm going to show you a few maps tonight. Starting with this one. This is basically a map of the known world at the time of the church. Okay, so Israel's, I have a pointer on here. We are here. Okay, but this is basically the world of Acts. So as we go through Acts, we're going to see. So obviously there's more to the world. There's Europe, more of Europe. There's Asia, there's Africa, there's the Americas. But the focus of Acts is right here. And so in verse 5 of Acts 2, it says, people there in Jerusalem were gathered from every nation under heaven. Okay, so speaking of exaggerations, this may be one of them. This may be an exaggeration. But much of the world was represented there at Acts. In verses 9 to 11, we have a list of all the nations and cities represented at this meeting. 9 to 11, we have Parthians, Medes, Elamites, dwellers of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, Libya, Cyrene, Rome, Cretes, Arabians. It's interesting, actually, the Arabians includes even the Nabateans. You guys remember the Nabateans? Where did you hear the word Nabateans before? From a bus trip? Those bus trips paying off? From Avdat. Avdat, the Nabateans lived there. So some of those guys were up for this meeting as well. But these were the nations that were gathered. So I have a map here just trying to show these red arrows are not every area, but a general sense of where everybody was coming from. It's showing that God had essentially gathered the entire known world to come to Jerusalem for this event. God had essentially gathered all the nations of the world to Jerusalem to hear his message. Again, as he puts it in verse 5, out of every nation under heaven. There were men there out of every nation under heaven. But the story doesn't end there. The amazement doesn't end there. Once again, we see God's sovereignty. He gathered everybody there, the entire world to come, to be saved and added to the church. They came to Jerusalem, they got saved. But then how did the church grow and expand? Later on in Acts, we read about the persecution of the church. The same people that got saved in chapter 2, those people from every nation that had come to Jerusalem. Maybe they were looking to settle in Jerusalem. But these people would be persecuted for their faith in Yeshua. And what did that persecution do? It caused all of these people, all these who had been gathered from all over the world, to then return to their home countries. God brought all the world to Jerusalem to save them, and then he sent them all back into the world. God knew that persecution would come. Yeshua already predicted that persecution was going to come. And when it finally came, it only helped the church to grow quickly. Now, nobody wants to be persecuted, and it's hard to think about what our brothers and sisters experienced in persecutions. But at the same time, we can be amazed at how God used those persecutions to quickly grow his church. Let's go to Acts 11. Acts 11, verses 19 to 21.
Which verse?
19 to 21. Acts 11. We see a bit of this spreading out due to the persecution. Verses 19 to 21. Now they which were scattered abroad upon the persecution that arose about Stephen traveled as far as Phoenice and Cyprus and Antioch, preaching the word to none but unto the Jews only. And some of them were men of Cyprus and Cyrene, which, when they were come to Antioch, spake unto the Grecians, the Greeks, preaching the Lord Jesus. And the hand of the Lord was with them. What does this tell us? The Lord was doing this. And a great number believed and turned unto the Lord. Persecution came, and God used that persecution to grow his church. His hand was still with them wherever they went, and he helped them to preach the gospel, to grow the church. It's amazing how God built his church. He gathered everyone to Jerusalem. He gathered the entire world, every nation under heaven to come. They get saved in Jerusalem. And through those persecutions, which God foreknew, he knew about it, these same people were scattered back to every nation under heaven. They were able to go back to their mother countries, speak their mother tongue, and tell others about Yeshua. This was how the church grew in the beginning, people going and telling others. This was before the New Testament was written. It wasn't just going and handing out New Testament. They went and they talked with people. But the amazement doesn't end there. Not only was it amazing how God delivered his message to men of many languages, not only was it amazing how God gathered everyone from around the world to hear God's message, not only is it amazing how he sent them back to talk to others, but it's amazing how he allowed for the spread of then the written New Testament to spread years later. My third map, the same area of the world, shows the conquest of Alexander the Great. 350 years before the church was created. Alexander the Great had a lot of problems, but he was a great military commander. And this just shows you, not the entirety, it goes almost to India, but everything that he conquered. The blue area. Quickly conquered the world within about 30 years. Guy was busy. So one of the things, so Alexander had conquered the world. And one of the things he did was he incorporated the Greek language into the different nations that he conquered. Okay? So by the time Yeshua came, and by the time the church was established, Greek was basically the universal language of the world. Similar to maybe how English is today. Everybody has their mother tongue, but many have English as a second language. So by the time the New Testament was written, and it was written in Greek, there was this universal language that could be understood by the entire world. So Greek was the universal language. And again, we see how God's timing was perfect. That language was there, established so that it could be written in a language where just about everybody in the world could read it. It's amazing. But that's not all. Not only did they have this universal Greek language, but there was also an infrastructure of roads to be able to carry these New Testaments throughout the entire world. So imagine the fourth map, the little red lines going all throughout the world. Maybe I'll send you on WhatsApp. But it's amazing to look at the Roman roads. Went everywhere throughout the empire. All the way up to England. 80,000 kilometers of Roman roads were established at that time. Realize that before that, many of these areas were pretty separated. But Rome had connected everything. Alexander came, gave them all the same language. Rome came together and brought them all together physically. It's amazing. God's timing. This was the world's first internet. Okay, it wasn't 5G, but it was effective. Because of these roads, people could travel freely with the gospel to every nation under heaven. God's timing is perfect. Question is, how far did the gospel spread in the time of the early church? How far did it go? Both through men going and speaking, and by people transmitting the written New Testament. According to Paul, in his lifetime, he was under the impression it had reached the entire known world. It had gone, according to Paul, it went to the whole world. Go to Colossians chapter 1. Colossians 1. I'm going to read verses 5 and 6 and then jump to verse 23. Colossians 1. Verses 5 and 6. So I'm kind of breaking in the context, but I'm just focusing on one specific thing he says here. For the hope which is laid up for you in heaven, whereof you heard before, in the word of the truth of the gospel. So he refers to the gospel. What about the gospel? Verse 6. Which is come unto you, as is in all the world. It says the gospel had come to all the world by the time he wrote Colossians 30 years later. Verse 23, he also says, if you continue in the faith grounded and settled, and be not moved away from the hope of the gospel. Again, he's referring to the gospel. What about the gospel? Which you have heard. You've heard the gospel. And which was preached to every creature which is under heaven. He's saying its gospel has gone to all the world. It's been preached to every creature under heaven. Maybe an exaggeration. But I don't know if it was a large exaggeration. Because God was in control. At a minimum, Paul was convinced that the gospel would reach every living creature. Again, God's timing was perfect. The conditions for the spreading of the gospel, for the growth of the church, were perfect. And God worked everything together in order to establish and grow his church. He gathered men from all over the world to one spot, to Jerusalem, to hear the message in their language. And then they were scattered back to the world. The New Testament then was written and spread throughout the world because there was a language that everyone could read. And there were roads that would be able to transport this written word to everyone. Does that amaze you? It amazes me. God's timing, how he works everything out for his purposes. All according to his plan, and it is all because he is a sovereign God. But we shouldn't just stop at being amazed. That amazement should cause us to seek God further. To be like the men in verse 12, if we go back to our text, we'll close here. Acts 2, verse 12. These men that wanted to know more, these devout, God-fearing men, were amazed, but amazement was not the end goal. The end goal is that it would cause us to know God better. We want to be like these men who saw these wonderful works of God and then ask themselves the question, what does this mean? When we're amazed by the wonderful works of God, then it should cause us to seek him further, to know him better, to grow close to the God who performs these wonderful works. As we do that, as we seek to know his wonderful works, as we're amazed by it, is it causing us to seek him further? Do we spend the time seeking him, reading his word? Do we understand the God that we serve? The God that's in control of everything? Does it draw us to know him better, to seek him? What's our response to the wonderful works of God? Let's pray.